With me today are Patrice, Arend, and Nicole Foley, employment partners who have been at the forefront of COVID-19 developments related to employment matters. Patrice and Nicole, there's been a lot of talk in the media about vaccinations from an employment perspective. I would imagine there's a lot of uncertainty, questions, need for more information, just with all of the considerations. So if we could start with the key question that's on a lot of employers' minds today, which is, can I require a vaccination?
Well, I can start that discussion. I mean, the short answer is yes, they can. The EEOC has issued some guidance on this issue recently, and they have indicated that, or at least they have not come out and said directly, you can require, but the way that you can read their guidance, recognizing that if you require, there are certain guidelines that you have to follow, infers that in fact employers can require them. But as with most things in the employment arena, those ability to require is not without some limitations. And I don't know, Nick, if you want to talk about a couple of those limitations and how
Sure.
employers should look at that.
Sure. I would also point out too that on the EEOC website, there is a running list of FAQs related to multiple COVID topics, and the latest FAQs are at the bottom of that list, and they're all devoted to this question of vaccinations. And like Patrice, you were saying, they didn't come out specifically and say you can mandate vaccinations. But what those FAQs demonstrate is if employers do decide to mandate, there are these exceptions and these other things that you have to take into consideration. The two most prevalent topics would be if an employee says, I can't get a vaccination because I have a medical condition, or I can't get a vaccination because of my religious beliefs. So those are the two most important things for employers to look at if they do decide to mandate vaccinations, among other things. But from a pure, legal perspective, and making sure that you're avoiding liability and avoiding risk, you have to be looking for those employees who are responding in a way that would trigger a discussion under the ADA or under Title VII for religious accommodations.
So I think what's key with both of those exceptions then is if you're an employer and you do have an employee that says, hey, I can't get a vaccination because I have a medical condition, a disability, or it's against my religion, there are certain things that the employer has to do in order to determine whether they will accommodate that. And the biggest question is whether looking at that medical condition, if the requirement for the vaccination is job related and consistent with business necessity. So you have to go through an evaluative process to figure out, first of all, how does that vaccine relate to that particular individual? And is there an accommodation that you can make that would further the employer's interest of making sure that most of the employees have the vaccination versus either the medical condition and the religious accommodation. So really the big issue is, does that the lack of the vaccination for that particular individual pose a direct threat to the workforce? And it's not going to be the same answer for every single employee, because it's very fact specific. You have to look at what the employee does, evaluate how many people they come into contact with, what would occur, what's the likelihood of harm if they don't get the vaccine, what threat to the workplace, how long is that risk going to take place? There may be a time when it becomes riskier with less people vaccinated, and or more risky if you have a workforce that the vast majority haven't been vaccinated yet, and it may become less risky if you have more people that have already been vaccinated. So that question may not be constant.
Right.
We asked that question today in terms of whether there's a direct threat, that the answer to the question may change over the course of time. So you have to go through that evaluative process and you figure out, okay, if this employee poses a direct threat if they don't get vaccinated, then what do you do with the employee? Do you get to fire them? And the answer to that question is not always yes either.
Right. And I think the analysis is actually going to be quite difficult because so many employers have been able to have their workforce working remotely. And so, one of the questions becomes, okay, we wanted to mandate all our employees to get the vaccine so that we can bring all of our employees back. But realistically, if you're being honest with yourself, these employees are able to continue doing their jobs from home. So is that a form of an accommodation? And I think the EEOC would say, yes, it is. And Patrice, to your point also, if it's not, if the duration of the threat is short, such that even if they couldn't do their job from home, if you gave them a short leave of absence, then that could be a form of an accommodation too. And I think the other issue is, and there's not an answer to this, but, continuing to wear masks is still a requirement by the CDC. So even if an employee says, I can't, because of a medical condition or a religious belief, I can't get the vaccine, but they're required to continue wearing their masks anyways, are they really a heightened threat by not getting the vaccination? I think at this point, until we know more, the answer is probably no. If everyone still has to wear their masks, including the person who chooses not to get vaccinated or can't get vaccinated, then is there really a heightened threat?
Yeah, I think that's really an interesting question, because clearly if you have someone, for example, that's working the midnight shift and they're the only one there and they don't want to get vaccinated, I think that's probably an easy case. If you have a situation where you have an employee that's working in an office, but you've followed the CDC and the OSHA recommendations in terms of social distancing, in terms of having, they have an office where they can close the door, or you've got your plexiglass barriers, like all of those things. This is why it's not a one answer for every single situation, because it's really going to be a fact-specific inquiry to determine what is the direct threat, what mitigations can you use. And to your point, Nikki, is, are there other, let's assume that those protective measures aren't enough to eliminate the threat. We have seen, at least through the CDC and OSHA and the EEOC, recognize that COVID-19 is a direct threat to the employees. The OSHA has not yet required employers to say, hey, you have to have your employees get vaccinated. OSHA hasn't gone that far yet, right. But you do have to look at, okay, let's assume there is a direct threat. Are there other ways? Working from home, family medical leave, the FFCRA. Are there other ways that you can accommodate someone who is unable or to get a vaccination for one of those reasons?
Right. And I think too, it's interesting, and Patrice, this just came up. We had a client ask this question of, once someone gets vaccinated, can we take them off of the quarantine protocol? And the answer to that is no. So it kind of also begs the question, and this is another topic that I think we can discuss, is should employers mandate this? If employers think that by mandating the vaccine, they can then eliminate the need for their employees to quarantine, which is obviously a huge concern. Obviously, aside from anyone getting sick from COVID, that's the number one priority. But for employers, the number two priority probably is keeping their employees working. And if you're out because you've been exposed and you can't come in, you have to quarantine, that's, one less body doing work. So, if the answer to that is just because you get the vaccine doesn't mean that you don't still have to follow quarantine protocols, it begs the question, should you really be mandating it? As opposed to what the EEOC says is strongly encouraging. And there are things that you can do to help facilitate and encourage employees to get the vaccine. understanding that it is, boosting their immunity. It has been found to, significantly reduce the effects of COVID, thereby keeping employees healthier. And so I think the EEOC is saying, let's strongly encourage people to do it, because there just doesn't seem to be enough positive factors for mandating it at this point.
Yeah, and I think the key comment is, at this point, this is a really fluid situation. And while we know that the vaccine provides protection, that protection, first of all, it's not 100%. 90 to 95% is pretty good, but it's not 100%. But what we don't know yet, and that what may change over time, is whether the vaccine prevents someone from becoming a spreader of the virus.
Right.
The purpose of the quarantine is, of course, it's the safety of the individual employee, but it's also the safety of others around that employee, which is why you do the quarantine. And what we don't know yet, and we may learn more information, because we're learning more and more about the virus and the vaccine through time. But at this point, just because you have the vaccine doesn't mean you can't spread it to somebody else. And that's one of the purposes of the quarantine. So until the CDC has indicated to the contrary, I think that employers should follow the latest quarantine recommendations until that changes.
Right.
So we touched on a little bit, should an employer require the vaccination? Could we expand on that a little bit more?
Sure. So, we started out talking about can they, and the answer is they can. And then, we talked a little bit more about should they, and we talked about the fact that you still have to follow all the protocols, the quarantine, the masking, the social distancing. So that sort of goes in the should they column. Another thing to think about from, a pure human resources or human relations perspective is, do you want to be the employer who is mandating that your employees be subject to vaccination? It's not, it could be considered invasive. I mean, you are forcing your employees to be stuck with a needle and to be injected with whatever is in, these in the vaccination. So do you want to be the employer that forces people to do that? How are people going to react to being told they must do something? These are all sort of, what's the human reaction? How do employers want to handle that?
Yeah, I think there's a distrust and sort of a morale issue. I mean, there are still a large segment of the population who are very nervous about the vaccine. One of which is, there are some people that don't believe in vaccines. There are other people who are particularly wary of the fact that this vaccine was developed so quickly. I mean, I'm not going to get into the medical science about that, but there are people that believe that makes them nervous. And so are you going to create a potential employee retention or morale issue if you require employees to get vaccinated? And you have to think about your employee pool and the reaction that the employees may have. Some may appreciate it and say, my employer is looking out for my safety, and I appreciate them for taking a hard line. You may have other employees that have the opposite reaction and say, I appreciate they want to keep us safe, but they can't tell me what to do. And I don't want to get this vaccine. And so as a result, I'm going to quit. So are you creating a retention problem? Or if you refuse to get it and you've got someone that refuses to get it for a medical reason or a religious reason, and you fire them because they don't fall, like you've gone through that analysis and they're not entitled to any other accommodation or legal protection, and you fire them, are you going to, how many people are you going to get rid of as a result of it? Because if you're adopting a policy, there has to be consistent application. What happens if your star salesperson is one of those individuals that refuses to get it and there's no other accommodation that can be provided? are you willing to go as far as to say that you need to separate their employment? So there are a lot of other issues other than just purely focusing on the narrow issue is I want to keep my employees safe and the legal issues involved. There's a human side of it, and it can affect your business in other ways as well. And so it's really something understanding what message is you as the employer, what environment do you want to create? What have you created in the past and how do you communicate that going forward? And understanding your workforce and how they're going to react to something like that to determine whether that's actually a good idea, and maybe strongly encouraged is the way to go.
Yeah.
So if the employer is requiring the vaccination, can they obtain proof of that?
Well, yeah, the short answer is yes, but again, you have to be really careful about that because in showing proof, you may have a situation where an employee can't show proof because they have refused to get the vaccine, either because they have a medical condition or a religious condition or religious belief that prevents them from getting the vaccine. And you don't want to be asking medical related questions in terms of why can't you get the vaccine and why can't you get me proof? Those are issues that you have to be very careful. I mean, the short answer is yes, but the longer answer is you have to be careful when you mandate it about what sort of questions you might be asking around the proof of that vaccination.
Right. Yeah, and so I think that these employers that want proof of the vaccine, if all they're getting is some certification from whatever medical facility they went to, that that a little piece of paper that says, yes, this person got the vaccination, I think that's fine. I think like any medical information, that has to be maintained in a separate medical file that should not go into the employee's personnel file. Everything should be maintained separately. And to Patrice's point, if for whatever reason that form has any of the pre-screen questions that could reveal the individual's personal health history, that could be very problematic for the employer. So they would need to make sure that what they're asking for is just confirmation that the employee received the vaccination and nothing else. And yeah, so, and I think, there becomes an issue also of how the vaccinations are administered. So if you are mandating that the employees get vaccinated and you are partnering with an organization that will come in and do those vaccinations, I think there's a different level of risk that you take, because since you're partnering with that organization, does that then make you privy to whatever pre-screen questions they are required to ask? Because whoever is administering the vaccine is required to ask those pre-vaccination questions to make sure that it's safe for the individual to get the vaccine. So there is something to be said for, do you have someone come in and what risk does that expose you to? Or if you're mandating them to get it, do you simply mandate that they on their own go out and get the vaccine, which creates less risk for the employer with respect to personal health information. But then obviously the employer has less control over making sure that their employees really are getting it.
So what are some of the other issues that employers should be thinking about?
Well, one of the issues that could potentially arise is, what are the workers' compensation implications if you as an employer decide that you're going to mandate that employees be vaccinated? What happens if you have a situation where you have an employee who has an adverse reaction to the vaccine? It appears that statistically those situations are quite rare, but if it were to happen, is that a workers' compensation situation? So I think before mandating a vaccine, it would be wise for employers to contact their workers' compensation carrier and to have that conversation. So on the IFCOM that you have an employee that is sensitive to vaccinations And this could be a potential workers' compensation claim, whether they're going to be able to get coverage.
Right. I think another issue too that the EEOC encourages employers to consider is if they are going to mandate, and even if they aren't going to mandate, if they're going to strongly encourage employees to get the vaccine, that the employer should be willing to be more flexible in the event that someone does have an adverse reaction. So aside from, it's a significant adverse reaction, there's a potential work comp issue, there are people who do suffer from more than just, soreness at the site of the injection. There are statistics that say that there's a higher instance of flu-like symptoms after the second shot, to the point where people might be, feeling like they've got the flu and need to be absent. So employers need to really strongly consider that they're going to be very flexible and very lenient with people who say that they're having a reaction, and allow those people to, take a few days to recover if they say that they need that. And another thing to consider, particularly if you're in an industry where, you run maybe 24/7 and you've got specific people on a line, if you have people stagger when they get their shots, so that if there are adverse reactions, you don't have an entire population of employees. So let's say on one shift, that all end up coming down with some flu-like symptoms and need to be absent, that you stagger that so that you're not out, an entire department or an entire shift.
Yeah, and in addition to to decide whether you're going to give people time off if they have an adverse reaction, are you going to give employees time off, excused from work to go get it, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you decide that you're not going to contract with a third party and bring them in to administer the vaccine, and you're going to require that they get it through the third party on their own, and they have to schedule an appointment to get that vaccination, are you, as an employer, going to give them time off in order to get that? And what impact is that going to have on your PTO policy? Are you going to make them use what's in their bank? Are you going to give them an extra day? I mean, I would imagine if you've gone to the point that you've decided to mandate the vaccine, that you're going to discuss time off for both of those issues within the rollout of that policy.
Right.
With any employment situation, the answer to these difficult questions is oftentimes very fact specific. And so please don't take anything as that we've said today as advice on your particular situation, because you really need to know what your particular situation involves so that we can determine what aspect may or may not apply to you.
So great discussion. Thank you both for your time. And we hope everyone found this information valuable, but please note that it is for informational purposes only and is in no way meant to be legal advice for your specific situation. If you have any questions or would like to suggest some topics for further discussion, please reach out to us on the Employment and Labor section of jaffelaw.com. Thanks for listening.